Way back when, in primary school, I was one of the cool kids. Why? Because our family had satellite TV. Now that counted for two things. One was being able to watch all the WWF wrestling, and the other, more importantly, was watching The Simpsons. Both had a major impact on my formative years, but The Simpsons comes first. America's first family have an odd history over here though, because they were big almost from the beginning. Do the Bartman was a #1 single over here. There were Simpsons lunchboxes, figures and the like, all of which were sold in big numbers. And then there were the games we're about to talk about. Everyone was talking about The Simpsons back in the early 90s in Britain. And yet, despite this, the amount of people who could actually watch the show was kind of small compared to how big the franchise was. Those who didn't have a satellite would have to rely on somebody who did. You know, maybe you saw it at someone's house. Maybe you got a tape with a bunch of episodes on it. Who knows? It didn't take too long for the show to become widely available. Sky TV just kept on growing and they eventually started showing Simpsons on the BBC anyway. But for my part, I loved The Simpsons more than just about anything else in the world back then, and I continue to do so throughout my school life. Shame I kind of fallen out of love with it now, but that's a whole other story. This isn't a look at The Simpsons, it's a look at Simpsons games, of which there is a lot. And do you know what a lot of them are? That's right, pure unadulterated cack. Worked on by software houses of low birth who didn't give a shit, churned out as quickly as possible in order to provide more money for the Simpsons juggernaut, and with it, the Murdoch Empire. The Simpsons might well be one of the biggest licensed game franchises out there, but most would agree that it's also one of the worst. However, the games aren't all bad. Some do have redeeming qualities, and there's even a couple that are good. But oh boy, certainly not all of them. Anyway, this top 10 list aims to grab all the wheat that's in the mounds of chaff. The games might start out being quite naff and we're going to have to dig deep to find anything appealing about them, but trust me, they will get better. Okay? So let's do it! Number 10.
Virtual Bart.
Right, let's not mince words. Virtual Bart is a pile of shit. Like a lot of Simpsons games, it's split into various miniature games, almost all of which involve you playing as Bart. Why Bart? Well, that should be obvious. He's the cool kid, the boy, the one who likes games to begin with. You know what he is? He was everything you wanted to be. Ain't that sad? Hacker. Anyway, Virtual Bart's minigames are mostly rubbish. There's some lousy prehistoric platforming, a weird Mad Max-esque post-apocalyptic biking section, a part where you go down a water slide, and something involving Bart as a baby. It's all just kinda chucked out there, with no thematic link whatsoever, and so it all just feels like a complete waste of time even before you get to the lame games. However, there is one minigame that I like. It's the one where you throw crap at your schoolmates. Hell, this one's quite addictive. Sometimes I've played it for ages, carefully plotting every throw, the satisfaction when you land a good hit. You have to fish for it sometimes, but it's bloody fun, really is. I mean, geez, you could put this on iOS and make a fortune. This minigame is, of course, the only reason Virtual Bart just about scraped the top 10. So just play that. Ignore everything else. It's for the best. Number 9. This is one of the few Simpsons games that I hadn't played previously. As far as PC games go, I had hoped to get Virtual Springfield on here, but alas, that proved to be impossible. And so we're stuck with this, which is not exactly a game I enjoyed. You get a choice of stages, almost all of which are hampered by irritating keyboard-only controls and enemies that are damn near impossible to kill. This is a really frustrating game, to be honest. Anyway, it scrapes in because the graphics are, at the least, of a much better standard than most Simpsons games from the early 90s, and there's even some clear speech samples to go on. Other than that, yeah, Bart's House of Weirdness is kind of a turkey. I just wish it was so much better. Hell, I wish there were more Simpsons games on the PC. Jesus, doesn't the complete absence of a proper Simpsons point-and-click game feel like a massive missed opportunity to you? Hey-ho. Number 8. Now, Bart's Nightmare is a lot like Virtual Bart, the only difference being that the game actually makes an effort to link all the stages together. Bart's having a bad dream and he has to grab all of his test papers, which will somehow lead to him getting a good grade the following day. The stages are at least a bit more inventive than Virtual Bart's, with the Godzilla stage being my personal favourite, although the gameplay, like damn near all these acclaimed Simpsons titles, is far, far from good. Truth be told, it's a very mediocre game, and there's hardly anything to say about it. However, it is perhaps the first game on the list that I would call, on balance, absolutely, thoroughly, 100% mediocre. So, you know, things are progressing quite nicely. Number 7. Now this is an amusing case, because I've actually only seen this game being played as opposed to playing it myself, and I didn't have any way of playing it for the list. However, I couldn't not include it. The Simpsons game might not be great, but it is at least of a higher standard than most Simpsons games, and so it deserves to be on here. All the characters make an appearance, there's lots of voice acting, tons of references to tons of things, and even cute little references to other video games. You've even got call-outs to games like Katamari Damacy, just to show you that the Simpsons boys are really down with it. Anyway, the game seems to be a lot like the show these days, at least when it's not being totally awful. It's funny in drips and drabs, and at best you can hope for something thoroughly acceptable. After playing it you wouldn't regret it or feel dirty or anything. It's okay, even if the only thing shocking about it was that it wasn't total shit. Number 6. Right, now this is one of the biggest Simpsons games. It may even be the one people remember the most, although perhaps not fondly. Bart vs the Space Mutants has neat graphics and a decent concept, saving the Earth from the Space Mutants by collecting objects, most of which are suitably off-kilter. Hell, getting rid of purple-coloured objects in the first level is actually kind of inventive, and in the right hands, this could have been a fine, fine game. However, the execution is just awful. The game's controls are broken, terrible item management, running and jumping attached to the same button. Ugh. Even the Mega Drive version, with 3 buttons at the ready, uses a control scheme that makes absolutely no sense. Doing big jumps require 2 buttons to be pressed, and they're close to impossible. And yet, despite all this, I still take a perverse enjoyment out of playing it, if only because it's just so familiar. It's that sense of nostalgia that keeps me from completely casting the game aside, even though it takes a giant piss on my memories any time I try to play it. There you go. Number 5. Okay, so having taken down the Space Mutants, Bart's, turned heel? Because now he's against the world. Which doesn't make much sense, seeing as Mr. Burns is the bad guy in this game, but we're one with it. Bart vs the World, at least in the Amiga version I played in the day, wasn't so bad. The controls were still terrible, they are after all basically the same as Space Mutants, but the stages were quite varied and the game didn't feel as frustrating as Space Mutants. Perhaps the guys who made it saw a bit of sense and thought that the levels in Space Mutants simply weren't suited to the control scheme at all, and they made changes accordingly. Although they didn't make the more obvious change, getting rid of the crappy control scheme full stop. But well, they were learning at least. Number 4. Okay, it's taken quite some time, but I'd say that our last 4 games are all absolutely, categorically good. And this one actually kind of pours water on me saying, a few videos back, that you couldn't possibly make a good game out of itchy and scratchy. Because it turns out you can. All you need to do is add some golf. Now the Simpsons games aren't exactly bastions of creativity, but this one does at least make an effort, mixing together the fine art of miniature golf with platforms, puzzling, and beating the shit out of itching. It's a formula we've not seen that much of before, and even if constantly making sure that itch is out the way before you step up to address the ball does get kind of old after a while, especially with the stages being pretty damn long for a golf game, it's a very good effort, and it makes for a very solid handheld game. Miniature Golf Madness seems to have flown almost completely under the radar. It's barely covered even by the most thorough Simpsons retrospectives, but I would definitely recommend giving it a look. It's worth a good half hour of your time at least. Number 3. Krusty's Super Funhouse got chucked into a honourable mentions section a little while back, but I don't want to repeat myself too much. What with this and the last entry, it seems that Simpsons games actually get quite good once they step outside the main family. Weird, isn't it? Anyway, it turns out that Krusty has a big rat problem. The professional rat catchers are all out on holiday, so everyone's favourite alcoholic clown has to resort to various contraptions to kill them. It's kind of like Lemmings, only in reverse. All you have to do is create the path for the rats to happily walk to their doom on. But then it doesn't take much for a puzzle game to be addicting, does it? This may not be a title with a lot of ambition, but then it doesn't have to be. I mean, it's a Simpsons licensed game, for heaven's sake. A franchise filled with absolute gubbins. Anything that's actually got a smidgen of quality behind it is going to be welcome. And this does have. It's good. Number 2. It could be argued that there are at most 2 legitimately good Simpsons licensed games. It's not exactly surprising that those 2 games have taken the top spots, really. I expected it. Hit and Run has you control Homer as he runs his daily errands, driving around Springfield, sorting out all his problems and, naturally, creating some more of his own. It's like a miniature Grand Theft Auto-esque sandbox. The entirety of Springfield's open to you, you can take command of any car you want, and you can drive around town causing tons of mayhem. Did you ever want to leave some tyre marks on the denizens of this little fictional town? Well, now you can. Hit and Run is, as you'd expect, a pretty light-hearted game. There's lots of gags and many knowing winks to the past. The only really odd thing about it is seeing Springfield's citizens in glorious 3D. It's nice that they did it, but it doesn't really look right. But this is quite a good game, and seeing as you could spend virtually no money at all buying it, it's definitely worth picking up. Number 1. And so here it is, the most obvious number 1 in the entire history of top 10 lists. How could I possibly throw a curveball here? Because this, for most people, is the only Simpsons game even slightly worthy of note. It's miles and miles ahead of all the others. If you were into the arcades in the early 90s, you knew this game off by heart. The Simpsons arcade game. That big 4-player cabinet would just draw you to it. It's like Homer seeing the big pie on the window ledge. You just know what's going to happen, don't you? Konami's Simpsons arcade game is a classic, a big beat-em-up in much the same vein as their earlier Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, and one that completely captured the feel of the show. All the game needed was that big sense of total anarchy, and the ability to bring people together. You know, it's funny really, because I look at all the previous games and I notice one thing that connects just about all of them. All of them are single player. And okay, it's not exactly workable to turn them all into multiplayer games, I understand that, but in a way that kind of missed the point of the show. Because one of the great things about The Simpsons, especially in its prime, was how it brought everybody together. It was one of the best shows around for kids and adults, as it had something for them all. And not just a wee little concession here and there, it's actually brilliant no matter what angle you're looking at it from, simultaneously one of the best adults and kids shows ever made. Simpsons games for me should have always been multiplayer, that's one of the main things wrong with them. And this one proved that, as it's possibly the best multiplayer beat-em-up from this whole era. Now there's nothing exactly complex about it, but it gives you that real group feeling. It's good with just one player, but with 2, or even 4, it's magical! It's The Simpsons. That sort of love and bonhomie is what all Simpsons games should have tried to capture, the family spirit. Unfortunately, this was the only one that did. So for that reason, not to mention a million others, fantastic graphics, super tight controls, lots of enemies, brilliant music, brilliant everything, lots of humour, basically being better than every other game on the list put together, it's the number 1 on this list by a long, long way. And so we leave The Simpsons behind. Part 1 of S is done. So we can now move on to our next big franchise. We're going all sci-fi. We're off on a journey to a galaxy far, far away, where we shall track the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Our next video is quite simply all about Star Trek. There's a big variation in games here, from adventures to shooters to strategy games and hell, almost everything in between. A lot of stuff to cover and fit into a top 10. It's a tall order, taller than a jacked up Kobayashi Maru exercise. However, as a certain captain once said, I don't like to lose. It'll come. Until it does, thanks for watching, and wherever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time.